Hello and welcome to this training session on National Financial Regulation B6, Section 38 and Section 39 arrangements. We are going to go through some of the key details you will need to know from NFR B6, Section 38 and Section 39 arrangements. We will start with our introduction on NFR B6 and then cover the purpose of NFR B6, the scope, legal framework, general requirements, governance process, performance monitoring and management, compliance requirements, protecting the HSE's interest and supporting you. What are the National Financial Regulations? The National Financial Regulations are a set of policy documents which set out financial controls for the organisation. They are not meant to be detailed procedural documents for financial processes or activities, as these are contained within your local procedures. But the aim of the NFRs is to provide high-level controls to guide your local procedures. Why is this training important? It is important that you are aware of the obligations of the HSE and non-statutory agencies, the HSE funding structure and how it relates to Section 38 and Section 39 agencies. NFR B6 applies to all funded agencies and all HSE staff with responsibility for management and administration of funding provided to the agencies. We will move on to the purpose of NFR B6. The purpose of NFR B6 is to set the respective obligations of both the HSE and non-statutory agencies. It provides controls to support a standardised approach enabling consistency across service relationships. The HSE must have in place appropriate contractual agreements with all agencies that have funding released to them for the provision of services in accordance with Section 38 and Section 39 of the Health Act 2004. NFR B6 applies to the funding of the following services: HSE staff involved in the management and administration of health and personal social services and related funding provided by non-statutory agencies. All non-statutory agencies receiving funding from the HSE for the provision of personal health and social services. These include voluntary, commercial, private and out-of-state agencies. This includes all funding sources, including any special schemes where the HSE is the funder. This policy does not apply to commercial contracts such as cleaning, catering, agency staff services and taxi services. Moving on to the legal framework. The Health Act 2004 confers powers to the HSE to contract for provision of certain services under Section 38 funding arrangement and Section 39 funding arrangement. Section 7, Part 4A states that the HSE shall manage and shall deliver or arrange to be delivered on its behalf health and personal social services in accordance with this Act and shall integrate the delivery of health and personal social services. Section 7, Part 5B of the Health Act 2004 states that the HSE, in performing its functions, shall have regard to services provided by voluntary or other bodies that are similar or ancillary to services that it is authorised to provide. So for Section 38 funding arrangement, these arrangements with service providers and the Executive may, subject to the available resources and by any directions issued by the Minister under Section 10, enter on such terms and conditions as it considers appropriate into arrangement with a person for the provision of health or personal social service by that person on behalf of the Executive. For Section 39 funding arrangements, the Executive may, subject to any directions given by the Minister under Section 10 and on such terms and conditions as it sees fit to impose, give assistance to any person or body that provides or proposes to provide a service similar or ancillary to a service that the Executive may provide. It is HSE policy that all funding provided to non-statutory agencies for the provision of health and personal social services is managed under this regulation. This includes all funding sources, including any special schemes where the HSE is the funder. All funding is recorded on the Service Provider Governance System, SPG system. This system is a database of agencies and funding arrangements. All funding and services are managed according to the Performance and Accountability Framework. Grant aid agreements and contract change notes are generated through the SPG system. There is a deadline of the 28th of February each year for completion of service agreements and grant aid agreement. For new and additional services commissioned after this deadline, the governance documentation must be completed prior to the payment of funding. Value for money is a key principle in NFR B6, and it requires that clarity exists in the service arrangement and grant aid agreement. The process of entering service arrangements must comply fully with the procurement provisions which are set out in NFR B1 procurement. It is HSE policy that first-time or expanded services may require a higher degree of oversight and approval. HSE personnel should not be appointed as directors of non-statutory agencies with which the HSE has an arrangement or grant aid agreement in place. This is due to the potential for conflicts of interest, which may undermine the integrity of the service relationship. The governance process provides for Section 38 service arrangements, which include acute voluntary hospitals and non-acute voluntary agencies funded pursuant to Section 38 of the Health Act 2004. For Section 39 service arrangements, it includes all non-acute voluntary agencies in receipt of funding over €250,000 pursuant to Section 39 of the Health Act 2004. It should be noted that some agencies in receipt of under €250,000 may, at the discretion of the HSE, be managed by a service arrangement. For Section 39 grant aid arrangements, all non-acute voluntary agencies in receipt of funding less than €250,000 pursuant to Section 39 of the Health Act 2004, all grant aid agreements are generated through the Service Provider Governance System. National Lottery funding is the exception to this general rule, with the governance requirements and grant aid agreement being managed at application stage. For other service arrangements, agencies in the commercial for-profit sector, regardless of funding level, and all out-of-state arrangements with agencies regardless of their voluntary status. The change control note process allows for changes throughout the year for funding, services, or both, after the governance documentation is signed. All change control note documentation is generated through the Service Provider Governance System. It is the policy of the HSE to ensure that a strong system of performance monitoring and management exists with agencies. This is a key control which enables the HSE to fulfil its statutory role in ensuring safe services of appropriate quality and value for money are delivered. To enable this policy's effectiveness, the existence of a detailed specification of services for the delivery of health and personal services, including a link back to funding allocation for each service arrangement and each grant aid agreement where applicable. A detailed review process to include submission of relevant documentation on a periodic basis, a schedule of review meetings for each year with a frequency that is appropriate. The review process should ensure that the funding is monitored, the agency is aware that services must be delivered within the available funding allocation, and no overruns will be accepted by the HSE unless they have been approved in advance and a change control note is completed. In certain circumstances, where appropriate, the review process should include inspections. These performance monitoring arrangements should always be conducted in a context whereby it is understood that the services are provided within and only within the amount of funding provided by the HSE and the complexity and type of services that are being provided. Where applicable, for each service arrangement and each grant aid agreement, reports should examine variations from the service specification and assess the need for corrective action. We will now move on to compliance requirements. An annual compliance statement must be submitted by voluntary agencies in receipt of over €3 million in the previous year. This must be submitted by the 31st of May the following year. Annual financial statements, AFS, must be submitted by all relevant funded agencies and be reviewed by the HSE. This must be submitted by the 31st of May the following year. An annual financial monitoring return must be submitted by voluntary agencies where they are managed through a service arrangement. This must be submitted by the 31st of May the following year. A chairperson statement must be submitted by voluntary agencies managed through a grant aid agreement. This must be submitted by the 31st of March the following year. Moving on to protecting the HSE's interests. Under the provisions of the Health Act 2004, the HSE may enter into agreements with and provide funding to voluntary agencies, Section 38 and 39 organisations, to deliver services on its behalf. This includes capital funding, such as for buildings, grants, motor vehicles and ICT or other equipment. The HSE is accountable to the Oireachtas for all expenditure using public funds, including any funds allocated to voluntary agencies. The HSE must ensure that the state's interest is protected in respect of all funding provided to voluntary agencies for investment in their asset base. This is done by ensuring retention of funded assets within the healthcare system, that is, continued use of the asset for health purposes, personal social services purpose, or both. For assets which do not have long-term value, structuring the provision of funding to realise the value of the investment in the asset by the state over the course of the life of the asset. For example, considering the effects of depreciation. For assets which have enduring value, provision of funding is secured against the asset and recycled back into the health system, personal social services system, or both in the event of a sale or the disposal of the asset, or in the case of liquidation or examinership. This brings us to the end of our presentation on NFR B6. In summary, we've discussed the purpose of NFR B6, its scope, the legal framework, general requirements, governance process, performance monitoring and management, compliance requirement, protecting the HSE's interests, and that concludes our presentation on NFR B6. Training and resources are available from the Governance and Compliance team. You can access our training videos on our Governance and Compliance YouTube channel, and the Governance and Compliance team can provide guidance and advice on the interpretation and application of the NFRs, and we also provide training relating to the NFRs. Our contact details are Governance and Compliance, Finance Specialist, National Finance Division, and our email address is govn.compliance@hse.ie. Many thanks for taking the time to join us today. Thank you.